we're really looking forward to talking about why buying a new translation management system before the end of this year will enable your team to drive greater revenue efficiency in the new year. We're also going to walk you through exactly how to do it. Brian's just getting his video camera sorted, but Brian is the Chief Revenue Officer of Smartling. There you are, Brian. Why don't you introduce yourself and say hello?
Hey guys, I'm the CRO here at Smartling. I've been with Smartling now for, 3.5 years. Prior to joining Smartling, I was actually a Smartling customer at a company called Adroll. So I went through the process of purchasing a TMS myself, did an RFP process, and selected Smartling. And then quite a few years after that, I obviously joined Smartling. So I've been on both sides of the fence, so to speak. So great to be here, Adrian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, you're the perfect candidate then to have on this webinar. So thank you, and everyone who's joined throughout the entire webinar. You might have questions. If you do, we're gonna answer all of them live on this webinar. So feel free to either go to the chat in the bottom right corner of your Zoom and feel free to ask your questions there. In fact, I invite you now to just let us know where you're dialing in from, because I'm in New York, and I know, actually, Brian, I don't know exactly where you are, so it'd be cool to learn where you are, and it would be great to know where everyone else is dialed in from. So that's one place where you can ask a question, but you can also use the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen if you have a question for myself or for Brian throughout today's webinar.
So Adrian, I am joining from the west coast of Ireland, in a county of Galway.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I hope you're having a great time there. Before we jump into the subject of today, I did want to just make one brief announcement, which is that yesterday, Smartling introduced our new transcreation tool. And the transcreation tool is an all new interface to write creative translations. And this is a really exciting new product that we've launched, which enables you to write content in a visual context interface. You can write multiple transcreation options with back translations, and then you can collaborate with the translator to select the option that makes the most sense for your content. This is great news because now you can say goodbye to all of the spreadsheets that you may be working with to produce all of the transcreations that you have in your pipeline, and it's available today. But let's get on, Brian, with the subject matter, which is how do we go about realizing efficiency with translation management? Because this is a super important subject matter right now. So my first question to you, actually, well, why don't we start here? Like, what is a translation management system, and why is it important for a business to be using a TMS?
Great. So I would describe a translation management system as a platform to help manage your translation efforts, right? And there's a few components of that. The first component, and probably the most, the one that people gravitate towards when they think of a TMS, is the ability to store a translation memory, right? So you have translators doing work on your behalf, and over time, they obviously aggregate a translation memory. So that's the first component that people will typically think of when they think of a translation management system. The second component is probably around workflow and organization. So I guess you could categorize that as the project management elements of a TMS. I would say the other two elements then are around reporting and analysis, analytics. And the final piece then is really around how you get content in and out of the platform. So anything to do with integrations or any kind of proxy services that might be available. So that's how I'd categorize the main components of a TMS and what a TMS does.
Yeah, and we've seen a number of our customers realize tremendous value in centralizing all of their content to a single translation management system. And the benefit of that is that you might have website content or blog content or help center content or product content. And as you mentioned, Brian, with all of the integrations, you can pump all of that content into one translation management system, where then you can leverage the benefit of having translated your content for one section of your content and use it across other segments of your content, which is tremendously valuable, especially this year, right? Because everyone's trying to figure out how to get the most out of their investment.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually should say that the piece I left out, one of the most important pieces, is obviously the CAT as well. So where the translators, log in and actually do their work, or any reviewers review the content that's translated. But you're exactly right, Adrian. So this idea of centralizing all your translation efforts, so both in terms of the content that's actually being translated, and the workflows, the reviews, is obviously key. We work with a lot of businesses that come to us, a lot of mature businesses, and they could be using several different TMSs, or in some cases they could be using no TMS, but a lot of different business units are doing translation and actually spending quite a bit of money on the translation services, but with no concept of centralization.
Yeah. So I think what's cool about the opportunity that we have today is your background and experience as a CRO means that you understand a number of different business functions across a company. But one of those functions is you understand how to invest in technology to make processes more efficient. And you know how to weigh the cost benefit analysis of any investment in a software product. So, I mean, the ultimate question that I want to ask and that we'll get to is, how do you create a business case for buying a translation management system? But before we answer that, how do you go about buying software? Like, what are the things that are important to buying software and services when you go to do it for Smartling, or how do you advise or encourage people to think about that investment?
Yeah. So I would put any software investment typically into two categories. The first category is around creating efficiencies, and usually taking cost out of the business. And the other category is around scaling. And that typically means you're driving additional revenue or additional profitability. And for a TMS and for what Smartling does, most of our customers will fit into one of those two categories as well, right? Either you're brand new to translation and you're using a TMS in an effort to expand into new language markets and obviously to capture market share, or you're already translating and the process that you're currently translating with is inefficient, right? Like you said at the beginning, is maybe it's not centralized. So bringing it back though to why buy software at all, it has to be one of those two categories: efficiencies or driving more revenue, more growth.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. What about the folks who are on the call? If you have a thought on that or a question, feel free to drop it into the chat and we'll respond to it. But as we think now about a translation management system, Brian, what are some of the efficiencies that can be gained? Because there are two things that you mentioned. There are ways that you can create efficiency, and then there are ways you can create scalability. So let's really drill down on that efficiency calculation. What are the inputs?
Just give me 1 second, Adrian. Sorry.
Sure thing. As we wait for Brian's return, again, feel free to ask a question in the chat. I see Paul from Silicon Valley. Good to have you here, Paul. Romina is dialing in from Germany. Great to have you here. Welcome back, Brian.
Apologies. I'm not sure if you guys heard, but that was my doorbell. Okay. Sorry, Adrian.
No worries. So we were talking about efficiency of when you go to build a calculation for whether or not it makes sense to buy a translation management system. What are the types of inputs that you would consider or that people should consider as areas of cost in managing translation?
Yeah, I think there's probably three elements to this, Adrian. I think the first is around resources, right? So how many resources are you using in your translation process in general, right? And that could be anybody from project managers to actual translators to reviewers, and really an analysis of the people that are involved in it. And there's obviously a kind of a cost in that, right? And sometimes we actually don't thoroughly look into that when we're thinking about the cost of a TMS or the cost of translation services or software. We look at the costs of the professional translation, the costs of the software. Sometimes we don't look at, the kind of the project management elements, the review elements, the kind of things that are core to the actual process, but sometimes it gets omitted. So that's the first piece. The second and third piece are just the two that I just mentioned, right? The amount you spend on software, any kind of technology to enable your process, and then the final piece is the professional translation cost.
Yeah, well, I think that the project management cost is a good place to start and to maybe poke around in a little bit more, because what we've discovered in being in business for more than 10 years now is that there's an enormous amount of content that has to be translated. And so the way that companies have historically solved this problem is by putting people on the problem. You have people who manage translation, and that's important. Like there certainly is still a need for people to manage translation, despite the fact that there are translation management systems on the market that automate a lot of the process. But what are the types of things that project managers are doing? And what are the types of things that they ought to be doing if they're not able to prioritize it right now?
Yeah. So look, what I will say is, depending on your level of sophistication, or depending on your specific requirements, you can configure a TMS to be majoritively automated. But a lot of folks opt not to do that because whatever the requirements is, or whatever the output that they want from a translation perspective, necessitates more kind of hand holding, right? The most common activity that you'll have a project manager doing is to coordinate and organize the translators and the workflow that the translators that flow through, right? So large customers will be pumping a lot of content through Smartling, for example, on a weekly basis. All that content can have different deadlines, can be different content types. Translators may be going on vacation, which affects the deadlines, and the content has to be shuffled around to other folks. So it's things like that project managers would need to factor in. They also will look at things like budgeting, things like costs, and ensure that we're actually getting an ROI from the translation work that's happening.
You brought up a really good point, which is that the activity will change based on where the company is on the localization maturity model. And we'll actually send an article to everybody who's watching the webinar about the localization maturity model, because it's a really good way for you to do a self-assessment, to understand where are you in terms of how agile can you be with your translation management program. And some customers, they come at level 3, but they want to achieve level 5, and others, they haven't translated a single word before, so they're at 0 and they just want to get to step 1. What I think is cool about that is you can self-identify where you are and then determine whether or not it's valuable to get to the next level, and we'll help you figure out how to do that. Your colleagues will help you figure out how to do that. But it's a good point you raise, because at different organizations, project management will look different.
Yeah. And I think that's it's the interesting piece of localization and of of translation, but it's also kind of one of the most complex pieces about the industry. There's a lot of different ways that you can configure your translation processes. And to your point, Adrian, really depending on the stage of your journey you're at, there's going to be a different structure in place, both in terms of software and services, according to where you're at.
I was researching a company a few weeks ago, and maybe I know you know it, Brian, but a number of other companies know it as well, which is Zapier. And one of the ways that they are trying to help people think about software automation is to sit down and do an exercise where you just write a list of all the things that you're doing on a recurring basis. One of the things that I do on a recurring basis is I look at data in one technology, and then I actually copy and paste, or I rewrite the data in another technology to do an assessment of performance. And I realized like that's something that could be automated. So I now use Zapier to automate the transfer of information. I think that would be a really interesting exercise for localization managers or project managers in this space, developers maybe touching the translation pipeline, to do for yourself, to figure out like what are the things that are really eating at your time. Because at the end of the day, the time is what's costing the company money, because we're all salaried, right? So we need to figure out how to make the most use of that time.
Yeah, absolutely, Adrian. I think one of the interesting things we did at Smartling around dynamic workflows was what we were seeing. Project managers were spending a lot of their time chasing reviewers to say, hey, would you mind reviewing that content? It's actually halting the go live of a web app or a website or some asset. And the reviewers were actually making very, very few changes to the content. So what we were able to do with dynamic workflows is we were able to say that, hey, we're going to route you this content. You've got 7 days to review it. If you don't review it in the 7 days, we're going to push it live, right? So, and that's obviously flagged. Now, the person can still retroactively review it and make changes, but what happens is you get predictability, right, in your timeline. And suddenly the localization project manager, they don't have to be the person following up to say, hey, did you review it? Can you review it? Which is obviously a very frustrating interaction for probably both parties, but a very time-consuming one.
Yeah, that's a great point. The dynamic workflows. There's a data point that came to mind when you were chatting there, Brian, which is the average piece of content stays for 21 days in the internal review workflow step for the majority of our customers. So that's a long amount of time. And you mentioned like you have to follow up with the internal reviewer, you have to follow up with them again, and then eventually you just say, okay, I'm going to push it to publish. All of that could be automated with dynamic workflows, which is a great solution. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about these the things that are costing companies money in project management. Let's switch gears. Let's talk a little bit about scale. How does scale get factored into the acquisition of a translation management system?
Yeah, so I think this is probably a slightly harder question to answer, right? So the first question you're answering is, we're already translating. Can we optimize our current process, right? And if you're not using a TMS or if you're not using technology, the answer is probably yes. Now, if you're not translating and you're using translation or localization to scale your business, you need to take a step back and you need to understand, is this the right thing for our business to do, right? For example, we're a US business, we've seen good success. Is there an addressable market in other language markets that we're currently not accessing? So, a business case has to be built up around that. What you typically see public traded US companies do, say just specifically for Europe, about 35% of their revenue will come from Europe, and then another 20 to 25% will come from other language markets throughout the world, right? So, or an average US publicly traded business, it's over 50% of their business is going to be outside of the US. Now, I'm referring to the businesses that are international in nature, right? Highly regulated or financial services businesses can focus just on one market and be very, very big businesses. So I'm only referring to the businesses that are already international in terms of their scope. So with that said, right, depending on where you are in your journey, in your growth journey, I think you need to have a lot of conviction that there is an addressable market for your product before you take that step and start translating. And there's lots of signals you can look at to understand if you're ready or not. A few easy ones, and then depending on the nature of your business, if you have any kind of inbound signals or inbound flow. If you're a B2B business, you might have a form on your website that's getting filled out. If you're an e-commerce business, you can see where your web traffic is coming from in terms of their IP addresses. And one thing you do want to look at is, without translating, how much of our traffic is coming from countries where the first language isn't the language that we're currently displaying our website or our products in. And, a good measure for that, if it's over 10%, you're probably ready to start to consider translating. So that's a long way of saying, Adrian, it's a complex decision, and it's definitely more than an individual department's decision. The entire company, all the way up to the CEO, needs to be behind the decision to expand into international or new language markets.
Yeah. And one of the cool things about using a TMS that enables the scalability is that if you decide you want to enter one new market or 5 new markets, it doesn't mean you actually have to go out and hire 1 or 5 more people to manage the process. The TMS, the integrations that you mentioned before, they provide all of that scalability and the infrastructure so that you can actually just say, at the end of the day, when the decision's been made, you can go into the product and say, we want to add French for France, and we want to translate, these 20 pages on our website, and everything else is handled from there by the translation management system and the translators.
Yeah. Yeah. At AdRoll, when we first decided that we were ready for new language markets, the first 2 markets we decided on were French and German. And we spent quite a bit of time getting the software in place, getting the workflows constructed, and just thinking about our brand and things like style guides and glossaries, which we might come to. But those first 2, we spent a bit of time getting in place. But then when we scaled subsequently to Spanish, to Italian, to Russian, and to other markets, we did that very, very quickly. And the reason you're able to do it quickly is because you're just replicating those same steps for new languages. Obviously you need to be thoughtful, again, from a business case perspective, that it's the right thing to do. But you're right, the beauty of putting a TMS in place and the beauty of putting these type of scalable processes in place, you can very easily turn on new language markets if there's deemed to be a business case to in fact do that.
Totally. I want to turn our attention a little bit now to digital transformation, which is something that has been happening for 20 years, and I think it will be happening for many years to come. But specifically, I wanted to focus on how in this year, unlike any other year, the digital transformation roadmaps were accelerated for every business. The businesses that had already crossed that chasm probably did a little bit better this year, because they already had the infrastructure in place to handle a remote workforce or a remote product offering. They were able to pivot through the pandemic a little bit more easily because of the technology investments that they have. If a translation management system wasn't part of this process, why, in your point of view, Brian, should a translation management system be part of the digital transformation process to ensure that businesses have their eyes focused on the future? And maybe we can also talk a little bit about something that you mentioned, which is important. It's not just one team that uses the TMS, it's the whole company. And when you make decisions about global marketing and sales, everyone, including the CEO, has to be on board and has to be part of that effort.
Yeah. Look, I think if we rewind, 20, 30 years, the number of businesses that were actually translating relative to the number of businesses translating now was quite small. So what we're seeing is more and more businesses that are successful in their local markets are translating and are globalizing because it's easier to do because of the digital transformation wave that's occurring over the last few decades. So I think for really strong businesses, globalization and localization is becoming table stakes. I caveat that with, it needs to be a strong business, right? If the business isn't growing, the cure for growth is rarely, let's translate into 10 languages. I think you need to have a business that has proved that you have product market fit in your local market, and then from there expand into other language markets. But I think if your business is scaling well in your local market, I think globalization and localization is becoming table stakes.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, because especially with the way that businesses have had to pivot, it's table stakes because you also need to be able to move quickly, and without the ability to move quickly, you're going to get left behind. There are so many competitors now for every single product segment, and those that are first to market, not just the first company to bring a product to a market, but even when companies are neck and neck, their ability to put out new features and functionality at a fast pace is becoming table stakes, as you said. It really, you have to be able to support local language. You have to be able to support it for new products and features as they are delivered, which is also occurring more rapidly. We should mention, it's not like companies are bundling all of their updates into a monthly or biannual release. They're doing it every day. So for localization to not be part of that daily exercise is a prohibiting factor if businesses are trying to operate multinationally.
Yeah, there's two businesses that are in the process of or have just IPO'd, which are Airbnb and DoorDash, and they're two really good examples of businesses where moving quickly is key. There's obviously significant network effects at play on with both businesses. The quicker you build up a supply side, the easier it is you're going to have demand on the other side of that. So for businesses like that, and for many other businesses, moving fast and being able to access new markets very, very quickly through their digital architecture is key.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's pivot now to the last section of the webinar, which I'm actually most excited about because this is where things are going to get fun. It's December 10th. There are 21 more days of the year. This is an opportunity for companies to make leaps into the future. Everyone's planning for the next year and they want to set themselves up for success. Why should companies buy a translation management system or get into a new one right now? What are some of the benefits? How would you be thinking about it if you were in the market? How do you think about it when you're evaluating tools outside of translation for our own business? What are your thoughts, Brian?
Well, the first thing I'll say is if you're buying any kind of software, the best time to buy it is at the end of the year. Or more specifically at the end of the financial year for the vendor that you're purchasing the software from. And that's very, very common right across the B2B space. So, what I will say, if you are considering purchasing a TMS over the next 6 months, it is worth starting those conversations ASAP to see if you can get something in place before the end of the year. Obviously, there's not that many business days left, but it certainly is possible. And like I said, that really does apply to any software tool. You're going to get better deals at the end of their financial years, which is typically the end of the calendar year.
Yeah, I think that's, that's a good way to start, right? You have the opportunity to get a better deal on the tool that you're looking at buying. But what are some of the other benefits, Brian, or what are some of the things that could position companies to be successful if they get this purchase out of the way before the end of the year? What does it mean for next year?
Um, well, I think people always underestimate the time required to get up and running, to get style guides and glossaries in place, to build integrations and um, set up workflows and configure them, and all those fun things. So, you know, I think doing this sooner rather than later, if it is part of your plan for next year, for 2021, certainly the advantage is you're buying more time. Um, at Smartling specifically, we pride ourselves in trying to get people up and running in 30 days. From the subscription starting to the first word being translated, we can do that within 30 days. But we'll move as fast as our customers, right? And typically, those lead times can be longer, right, because of conflicting priorities across other teams, and it can sometimes look more like 45 to 90 days. So what I will say is, don't underestimate the time it takes to get up and running with translation. There's a lot of different folks internally that need to be coordinated. So certainly, one of the advantages, not only from a price perspective between now and the end of the year, also from a time perspective, right? You're going to start off 2021 on the front foot.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. We onboard our customers quickly as they need. Start the year off on the right foot. Another point to make, it's a rather blunt point, but some companies have budget that have to be spent within the calendar year. This is a good opportunity to use that budget on a tool that will enable you to be successful for the next 365 days. So that's another positive way of thinking about this.
Sure. Yeah. We obviously hope people make prudent decisions with those remaining budgets or remaining dollars that are left. But look, I think one of the things we pride ourselves with at Smartling is the fact that once folks do start working with us, we typically have very long relationships with customers. SurveyMonkey, who's our first customer over 10 years ago, is actually still a customer now. And a lot of our customers that we've signed up over the years, it's rarely a 1 or 2 year relationship with Smartling. It's typically something that spans 3, 5, 10 years, like SurveyMonkey.
That's a great point. And it should be noted that every customer gets a customer success manager, an account manager, a solution engineer. So we have a full team of people who are dedicated to the account to ensure that you know how to use the product, that you're integrated as efficiently as possible. And then we've got an entire translation arm that will do all of the translation services for you. So you don't have to think about a translator holiday. You don't have to think about hiring or finding translators. All of our translators know how to use the translation management system and the translation interface. So many benefits to getting started sooner rather than later.
Yeah. If you are starting your localization journey and it does feel daunting, I was there myself when I purchased a localization tool back at my previous company. So I know how you feel. But what we do at Smartling is we try to take as much effort of the process for you out as you want, right? Some folks want to be very hands-on and they want to be in the tool and doing a lot of configuration and having a lot of control over various different bits and pieces, but some folks don't, right? Some people they just want French, German, Spanish delivered for these different content types. And at Smartling, we have the flexibility to deliver in both those manners. And we have a lot of customers that operate in either of those structures and everything in between. So, you know, if your goal is French, German, Spanish in, you know, these different content types, and you want to have a kind of a hands-off experience, we've got you covered. If you want to have a very, very hands-on experience, and whatever that means, different things to different customers, but whatever it means from you, you know, the Smartling tool is quite sophisticated and can also enable that experience.
Yeah, those are all really strong points. Brian, I suppose I have just one more question for you, and then we'll wrap it up early so everyone can get a little bit of time back. When we think about the business value of a translation management system, what are the types of things that we talk about with customers a year after they've started to work with Smartling? What are the numbers that we look at, and we hope that that we work with them to uncover so that they can see the impact of their investment?
Yeah. So, you know, the first one might be the most obvious one, which is, you know, what is the revenue or growth impact of translation? So if you've just expanded into a few new language markets, or if you've just tweaked your localization process for all your languages or a number of languages, are you seeing an uptick in revenue or growth, right? The second then is from an internal resourcing perspective, have you seen efficiency gains, right? Are people spending less time on certain tasks, or people spending less time generally on localization? And then there's lots of, you know, more granular measures we'll look at, things like, you know, what are your costs per word, what's happening at each workflow step within Smartling in terms of how much review you're doing, how much is getting changed. We look at different issues and comments that are raised on strings to try to get a handle of the back and forth and potential inequality issues. So there's lots of much more granular things that we look at, but taking a higher level view on it, Adrian, it really is, are we seeing growth as a result of these efforts, and or are we seeing efficiency gains?
Cool. I've got one question that was sent to me directly from, okay, so the question is on Adobe Experience Manager. And I'm just gonna, the question involves different versions of Adobe. The question was, we're using Touch 6.2. What happens if we're considering to move to AEM Cloud? Is there support for AEM Cloud? How does Smartling go about thinking about adding support?
Yeah, so we've customers on both. You know, one of the things we pride ourselves in is the robust nature of our integrations. So, you know, an integration can't really be thought of as a box ticking exercise. Do you have this integration? Yes, no. Because when you unpack that, there's different versions. There's different, maybe even types of integrations, and they change a lot, right? The different, how they're configured, how the API calls go back and forth change. And as a result, you need to stay on top of that, right? Because if you're not on top of it, and the way the connector is configured isn't aligned with a new version, it's going to break. So like I said, one of the things we really pride ourselves with, and we actually have an entire team focused on just connectors and integrations, is that our connectors are very, very robust, because we spend a lot of time working on them, but we spend a lot of time getting to know the product teams at these other vendors, at Adobe, at Contentful, at Sitecore, at Episerver, all of these content management systems.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And it's worth noting that we actually partner with Adobe to build out these integrations. And years ago, they came into our office because they knew that we were the experts in translation and localization, and they actually built some of their framework, their framework of the Adobe platform around the recommendation and guidance that we offered. So we have good relationships there, and we know how to work with them. We've got another question from Paul, Brian. How has the digital transformation and changing consumer look and feel of the localization landscape for 2021. Paul, did I get that right? How is the digital? I think we lost two characters there, but how? Yeah, got bored when I said it. It's no worries, Paul.
So
I think the question's around like how has digital transformation and the changing consumer maybe habits impacted the localization landscape for 21. Here we go. It's been resent. The question got, I sent it. Consumer needs. Okay, got it. Thank you. Such as, oh, okay. So the question is around how consumer needs have changed. We're all at home. Some people are gaming more. Some people are ordering groceries online. A lot of people, I've been doing that for a while. How is digital transformation and the consumer's needs changing have an impact on the field of localization for 2021? That's a great question.
Yeah. So I think what we're seeing is there was probably an acceptance, maybe 10 years ago that some products and services just weren't going to be translated into your language, right? They were in English, for example. And if you wanted to buy them or interact with that product or service, you just had to fumble your way around in English if you didn't speak that language, for example. I think that acceptance is dwindling. I think people expect now, if you are a modern, sophisticated business with product and services that are appropriate for multilingual markets, that you are in those markets, you're selling in those markets, and not just from a language perspective, also from a currency perspective, from a logistics perspective, that you're able to serve that customer based on their needs, which could be multilingual, multi-currency, and based in a country that might not be the United States, for example, right? Might be somewhere in Europe or somewhere in APAC. Do you have the logistics to support that? So I think there's now an expectation, Adrian, that that will be provided in all of those categories.
Yeah, and I think the other point to make is that all of the experiences that we have today are digital experiences. Like supermarkets are physical stores. You walk in, you see a banana, you walk out with a banana, but you can now do that on your phone. And so now the shopping experience is a digital one, and all digital experiences are powered by content. And if you want to scale your experience, your product experience, to have users worldwide leveraging it and subscribing and buying, they need to be able to understand the content, plain and simple. Yeah. So there's a larger scope of opportunity there as well that businesses have to think about. And Paul, I think that the pandemic simply accelerated the adoption rate of tools that were already going to be winners by the end of this decade. It simply accelerated the adoption rate. And companies now have realized, either because they have unfortunately had to close or drastically scale down their businesses, that the adoption of these technologies are actually going to help their business. They may be new, they may be a little scary, it may mean an adjustment of the way they do business, but people want to be able to do things from their phone. and that's where the majority of people are spending their time when it comes to consumption of digital experiences or products.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Adrian. People want to do things from their phone because it's easier. Right? They want easier, more straightforward experiences. And that often means that content needs to be translated into the language that is your native language, right? That's just another component. The product needs to be priced in a currency that that's hitting your bank account, right? It's euro, or it's maybe not US dollars, for example. So consumers, I think their expectation in terms of the ease at which they can make purchases now has certainly increased. And I think the pandemic, like you pointed out, has just elevated that expectation.
100%. And I love that you brought in the paywall We don't do paywall technology, but it's a really important piece of the localization puzzle because in the US, Apple Pay is ubiquitous, but in parts of Asia, there are other payment technologies that are more familiar, and buyers simply will not buy unless they see that payment technology. So it's a really good point. And it also amplifies the point you made earlier, Brian, which is that translation and localization can't be siloed. It's part of the whole business. It's a corporate wide strategy, and there are a lot of elements that have to be considered. And buying a translation management system is just one of them, but we're here to help you. I found, Brian, this to be a really insightful session. So thank you so much for your time. Are there any closing thoughts that you have?
I think, look, the final thing I'll say is that I know if you're new to localization or translation or just embarking on your journey, I know it can be daunting. There's a lot of different choices out there. There's a lot of different ways you can approach localization. It's okay to be overwhelmed, and that's what we're here for. You know, we're here to try to simplify the landscape, to simplify the type of solutions that that can be overlaid onto on the issues or challenges that you're seeing. So, you know, feel free to drop us a note on the website if you think we can help, and hopefully we'll do exactly what I said, which is, you know, simplify the landscape, provide some solutions that make sense for your business.